Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 6, we're asking if and how our human rights are threatened by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Todd Landman. In our final episode of the series, I'm delighted to be joined by Arlene Tickner and David Owen. Arlene is a professor of international relations in the Faculty of International, Political, and Urban Studies at the Universidad de Rosario in Bogotá, Colombia. David is a professor of social and political philosophy at Southampton University in the United Kingdom. Together, we're reflecting on the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and migration. So welcome to this episode of the Rights Track. It's super great to have you both here. And we're joined, with Arlene in Colombia, David joining us here from the UK. So it's a truly transatlantic discussion we're going to have today. And I wanted to start our conversation with David really on a conceptual level. Could you just explain briefly the relationship or the interrelationship between democracy and human rights?
Democracy, just conceived initially as a kind of way in which people govern themselves, has in its modern form seen human rights as kind of basic. So membership in democracy is about having effective human rights protection. So the intertwinement is that human rights secure your basic standing, interests, and dignity, but membership of a democracy is what is meant to ensure that those rights are available to you. So it's not a sort of simple, one based on the other relationship. It's a kind of mutual entwinement.
Right, so there's a nice mutually reinforcing relationship between the two. And of course, some definitions of democracy we consider to be thin. So they have a tendency to focus on basic civil and political rights, right to free speech, right to assembly, right to have your voice, to challenge incumbents in government. And democracy, of course, is the means by which officials in government are not only chosen, but held to account, and how you make transitions between different administrations. A thicker definition of democracy would include the protection and realization of economic, social, and cultural rights in terms of the availability of education, health, welfare, and have much more of an egalitarian or equalitarian focus. And so there are varying degrees of definition of democracy, but all of those definitions include this rather strong interrelationship between democracy and human rights. And if I were just to push you a little bit, David, then this existential threat from the COVID-19 pandemic, in what ways do you think COVID has compromised the ideals of democracy and the protection of human rights?
I think that COVID has made apparent to us how far we are from the ideal. In a sense, we all knew that we weren't in a kind of ideal democratic condition, but COVID has done at least three things that have put into question the, if you like, everyday idea of democracy or ideal of democracy that people have as a sort of working background in their ordinary everyday lives. The first is that within states, it's made very clear how different people are treated very unequally. So how, for example, citizens, permanent residents, temporary migrants, undocumented migrants, asylum seekers and refugees are all treated very differently. Among those who are citizens or permanent residents, there's also a big divide between those, as it were, who can work from home and those who have to go out and expose themselves to the pandemic. One of the noticeable features of the pandemic has been how what were often called low-skilled jobs have now suddenly been reconceived as essential workers. And that's an important thing going forward, to think about how crucial certain roles are to the human rights infrastructure of the state. The second thing that it's made clear to us is the depth of global inequalities in relationship to issues around health more generally, but health has generated that sense of how, Africa has 3,000 intensive care beds on the whole continent. The issue of health and disease exposure in Africa is an important one, not least because, of course, we have been busy, we in the global north have been busy recruiting medical professionals from Africa over the last 20 or more years. And the final thing that I think it made clear to us is how radically interdependent we all are, both within states and across states and more generally in kind of transnational contexts. The pandemic has made clear as climate change should have already done, but in a sense, because it's been more slow moving, has not made so vitally visible, so urgently visible. Pandemic has made clear how the weakness of our global system, that poverty, weak health systems, lack of education, lack of global cooperation, are threats to all of us, not just those who are typically burdened under the old normal.
That's a great summary and really great entry points for me to turn to Arlene. Arlene, you're based in Colombia. Colombia, is often cited as a democracy in the democracy literature after La Violencia and the clash between liberals and conservatives. There's a long period of almost taking it in turns democratic framework. There was a constitutional order, but at the same time, there was a struggle against paramilitaries and armed revolutionaries within the country, alongside the struggle against the narco-traffico trade, which we see in popular media, as well as in commentary on the many crises that affect the country. But a lot of that stability of the, at least, exchange of power has become unraveled as of late. And very recently, we've seen popular protests against the state and a critique, if you will, in the response to COVID. So from your perspective, sitting in Bogotá, how do you reflect on what David shared about this interrelationship between human rights, democracy, and of course, the threat of the pandemic?
I completely agree with David's analysis. I would speak not only of Colombia, but of Latin America writ large, which is a region in which democracy is increasingly, if not under threat, increasingly questioned by the population as the best form of government, given its failure to deliver on a number of fronts, including health, education, pensions, work. And so I think David's point that the pandemic has underscored, if not worsened, I would say in the case of Latin America, different forms of inequality and differential treatments of distinct sectors of national populations is tremendously relevant for understanding not only the crisis of democracy in the region, but also growing social protest, both in Colombia and I would say, again, across most of Latin America. The pandemic, again, has put this into staunch relief. Latin America has been the worst affected region. 35% of all of the world deaths are concentrated in Latin America, whereas the region represents only 8% of the global population. And so the situation is comparatively much worse. And if we turn to also the vaccination efforts in the region, most countries, including Colombia, have been very slow both to obtain vaccines and to apply them. In some countries, such as Paraguay, just to mention one, vaccination efforts are only now just beginning. And so, whereas in the UK or the United States, not to mention other countries in Europe, the pandemic is not over by any means, but populations are returning to some semblance of pre-pandemic normality. In Latin America and in Colombia, we're now experiencing another wave of the pandemic, which is accruing even higher numbers of deaths. Today, Colombia represents pretty much the top of the list in global deaths daily, given the rise in cases of infection. And so, again, I think this speaks to the limitations of democracy, at least understood in a liberal way, and its shortcomings in terms of its deliverables in relation to human rights, understood in a wider sense. And I would just add to what David has already mentioned, that this has obviously a gender, race, and a class component that, again, has come into painful visibility in Latin America and elsewhere across the world.
Thank you for that. And this stat that you quote, 35% of all deaths concentrated in Latin America, that's not widely known. It's almost a myopia when it comes to Latin America. It's a region that had its turmoils in the 1980s and 1990s, and transitions to democracy, however procedural and thin they might be, was seen as a great triumph, part of the third wave of democratization. And the world's attention turned to terrorism. It turned to other regions in the world that were full of conflict and crisis. And yet, you're now sharing with us this idea that, if you look at Brazil, you look at Brazil's response to the pandemic, you look at the spikes in cases in Ecuador, refrigerator trucks on the streets, the problems in Peru, etc. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about the Colombian case, this recent spate of protests. What were they about? What was the government response? And how's the situation there progressing?
The protests, and I would just note Colombia, in contrast to many other countries in Latin America, doesn't have a long history of social protest. And this one might attribute to an over half-century war. And so once the peace accords were signed with the FARC insurgency several years ago, it was to be expected that social protests would rise, which is pretty much typical of any process of political transition. And so there's been waves of protests going on since the peace accords were signed several years ago. But the immediate spark for this latest wave was a tax reform being proposed by the government of Iván Duque at a very inopportune moment. To my mind, Colombia is the only country that has proposed a tax reform in the midst of this pandemic crisis. And it was deemed that the reform would have affected the middle class in particular. It didn't propose necessarily raising taxes on the most wealthy. And this sparked a tremendous reaction across the country. But I would say that beyond the immediate spark, the protests respond to, a huge number of different forms of social and political grievance. One is the lack of effective implementation of the peace accords, which promised a number of things on which the government has either been unable or unwilling to deliver. Discontent with education and the lack of access to education of many underprivileged Colombian youth, which have actually led the protests and continue to protest. Frustration with the government's efforts to combat the pandemic, frustration with, in general, a deteriorated health infrastructure, protests against the lack of adequate and dignified work. Also discontent with state handling of pensions, not to mention, myriad other issues such as the environment. So we're essentially talking about social protests which have arisen due to a large number of sources of grievance and discontent that have been unaddressed by the Colombian state for many years. And sadly, the response of the Duque government via the use of excessive police force only worsened the situation. And so one would have hoped that the government would have been sensible enough to create some form of dialogue with the different sectors of the protests. And essentially the offer of dialogue has kind of been an empty offer that has only led to, a worsening of the situation.
It's this topic of social protests that interests me in the UK context, David. We saw last summer Black Lives Matter protests. We saw the tearing down of statues. We saw, street protests of quite large number. We had a violence against women protest. And then we saw the anti-lockdown protests, anti-mask and anti-vax protests. And then just recently with the Euro 2020 competition, we see large swaths of people going to large football matches and being out in public. And this interaction between, citizen activity, large crowds, protest, grievance, and response from the UK government, how do you reflect on this general question of how does democracy respond to crises? And what do you see, how do you see that playing out in the UK context?
Yeah, in the UK context, it's been interesting because on the one hand, there's the issue about public health and public health security and what role having large-scale events, whether permitted, like the current sort of football events and like Wimbledon, or relatively unpermitted, like many of the Black Lives Matter protests and anti-kind of colonial sort of statue removing protests. So there's one kind of question there about, how do you balance security of public health against rights to protest? And the right to protest is, one of the most fundamental democratic and human rights, because it's the way in which those who are subject to rule are able to kind of express their views about the rules to which they're subject, including, as it were, existing interpretations of human rights by the government. So that's one dimension of the problem. The other is, I think, a much more worrying issue for democracy in the UK, which is really, I think, a lesson learnt from Trump in America, which is the use of culture as a way of provoking and intensifying social division. And that's something which I think we've seen Johnson's government, and perhaps particularly the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, push this kind of appeal to a certain sort of small c cultural conservatism and try and sort of use the so-called sort of woke stuff against other political parties, against the kind of progressive left broadly conceived. So there's a certain sense in which culture and cultural identity is becoming a kind of key battleground for what kind of democracy you want. Whether you want to go to a relatively thin kind of democracy with a very strong executive that we've kind of seen in Turkey and India and Russia and elsewhere, or whether you want a kind of more egalitarian form of democracy in which people actually have genuine opportunities to participate and engage in, as it were, collective self-government.
That's very interesting. And you use this idea of wokeism, and there's a recent piece of empirical work that's been done on the UK that shows that the idea of woke is something that's not yet in the popular consciousness, broadly speaking. When you ask a random sample of the public in the UK about, are you familiar with this concept of woke, the percentage response is still relatively low. But there was a commentary on this piece this week that said, actually it's on its way. This wokeism, culture war aspect is coming. And so you've pinpointed this idea of using culture as a way to promote social division at a time when actually social cohesion, collective response, and a dialogue with the state is needed more than ever. It goes back to what Arlene said in terms of all times to bring in tax reform. This is probably not the right time to do it. And, we're seeing this, of course, with the government response. This is our last week of restrictions in the UK. There's a lifting of restrictions despite the climb in cases. And there's this sort of conflict, if you will, between, one imagination of what Britain could be and another imagination about what Britain ought to be based on what it used to be. I wonder if you just had a quick comment on that, and then I want to turn to this topic of migration.
It's been drawn out really starkly in the Euros with the English team, that we've seen two very different visions of England, and I will say England rather than the UK. One represented by the football team as a sort of diverse, multicultural, tolerant, bring people together vision. And on the other hand, a vision represented by the current government, which is very much focused on division and generating division and ruling through division. So it's a very different image of England and being presented. And that's become, I think, quite clear to people over the last few days.
Yes, it does become stark, and the stark contrast between, the success of the team and actually getting second place is still a measure of success in that particular competition. The work that these players have done, both on the field and off the field, in terms of promoting social justice, and then the response to the penalty shootout, as it were. I wonder now if I might turn to Arlene. I understand Colombia is one of the largest recipient countries, if you will, of migrants, and in particular migrants from Venezuela. And again, a similar story of it taking it in turns democratic framework from the late 1950s, early 1960s on until the 1990s, when the constitutional agreement in a way unraveled, and Venezuela has struggled with maintaining a kind of liberal democratic order since the mid 1990s. And you see this migration of Venezuelans into Colombia. But of course, coupled with the pandemic, this creates a double challenge for the Colombian state. So what's the circumstance with this influx of Venezuelans into Colombia?
Well, as you just said, the Venezuelan crisis is both a political crisis and a humanitarian crisis. And sanctions imposed by the United States in particular have unfortunately and unintentionally, I would say, worsened the conditions of many Venezuelans who have made the decision, mostly for socioeconomic reasons, to leave the country. And many of them have ended up staying in Colombia. There are currently, to my knowledge, almost 2 million Venezuelans in the country. Colombia is by far the largest recipient of Venezuelan migration today in Latin America. And sadly, the countries of the region itself have been unable to agree upon a joint strategy to address this situation. I guess to his credit, President Iván Duque has decided to afford all Venezuelans who have entered the country before January of this year, 2021, a temporary protection status, which has been applauded globally. But as you just mentioned, Todd, the combination of this influx of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans with the pandemic has created an even larger strain on the Colombian state's fiscal capabilities. And I think I would just add that in addition to the strain, in my mind, one of the reasons why the Duque government has decided to adopt this seemingly generous attitude towards Venezuelan migrants is also a means of pushing his agenda towards the Maduro regime in Venezuela, in the sense that Colombia, this Colombian president in particular, has been the most outspoken in terms of the need to force Maduro out of power without considering some form of negotiated transition, to which now the Biden administration in Washington is currently warming up to, because it's essentially the only way to go about resolving the situation within Venezuela and eventually creating conditions under which at least some of these millions of Venezuelans who have been forced to flee would feel comfortable returning.
Yes, and the other major political development, if you will, in the region, a bit closer to the United States, of course, is this widespread set of social protests in Cuba against the regime, with Biden's backing, at least this week. And curious what your reflections are and what's happening in the Cuban situation.
Well, I think the two main shocking developments in the region in the past few days have been the assassination of the president of Haiti, in which sadly Colombian ex-militaries are suspected of participating, and the protests in Cuba. And I think not surprisingly in both countries, there's been widespread social protests, as in the rest of Latin America, as we've mentioned. In Cuba, these protests came as a surprise to many, but I think, essentially are a response to also growing social discontent with the Cuban government's handling of the pandemic, and discontent with obviously the lack of certain human rights, which we've been talking about. And so the regime has accused the protest, of being a U.S. sponsored plot, which I think is a stretch of one's imagination and kind of to be expected on the part of the Cuban regime. But in all fairness, one of the reasons why this crisis has exploded at this particular moment is that the strict measures adopted by the Trump government in terms of stopping the normalization of bilateral relations initiated under Obama, and in terms of strengthening different measures related to the embargo, most importantly, stopping remittances from being sent to different Cuban, citizens who have family members in the United States, and stopping U.S. citizens from traveling, has actually, hit the Cuban economy tremendously hard. Cuba depends essentially in 70% of its foodstuffs are imported, and the economy depends quite strongly on remittances and tourism. So both the sanctions and COVID have affected the Cuban economy quite tremendously, and the lack of remittances has meant that Cuban citizens can't access foodstuffs, and so now we're seeing long lines to wait to buy minimums that are available on the island today, quite similar to the special period of the early 1990s, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the whole situation has been compounded, obviously, by the crisis in Venezuela, too, given the lack of capacity of the Venezuelan state to continue providing oil and funds to Cuba. And so I think it remains to be seen how this all ends up. But it definitely took the world and the regime by surprise. I think it would be an exaggeration to say, as many Cuban Americans are now celebrating in Miami, that this is kind of the end of the Cuban regime and the revolution. But most definitely it speaks to similar sources of discontent in Cuba, related to socioeconomic conditions, that we could, add to that the lack of democracy and human rights that are characteristic of Cuba in general.
Oh, it's just a brilliant summary. And, so many of the issues we've talked about on the Rights Lab are in high relief in all of these country examples. So I suppose now, with our closing thoughts, if we step back out to the conceptual, I'm interested in both of your thoughts about this general question, the relationship between democracy and COVID. We've seen the country case examples. We might draw the conclusion that democracies weren't particularly good at responding to this crisis, or we might say that, they got a rough start, but they kind of got their act together. And it was that, how does this all end up question that you raised, Arlene. I don't want you to look into a crystal ball necessarily, but we have a new wave of the Delta variant, possibly a Lambda variant. We don't think COVID's finished by any stretch. But what's the way out for all of this? Do we see an undermining of democracy that will continue, a resurgence of democracy and decision-making that should be able to address these problems in the future? Or is the inner combination or the inner relationship between all these different factors just going to be a real set of challenges for the future of democracy more generally? And maybe I'll turn to David first and then go to Arlene.
Certainly most European democracies, which is the cases I know best, the massive visibility of social and political and economic inequality may be a spur for a kind of re-engagement of social democracy, a move back towards taking equality and the ever accelerating levels of inequality seriously. So in that sense, I'm hopeful. In terms of how it worked out in particular places, I think the pandemic will have an effect. I mean, I think we should give a shout out to Portugal in the EU context, because Portugal very early took a strategy of basically giving temporary regularization status to all their irregular migrants who'd been in the state for more than 90 days and could, had a certificate to show that, and gave them basically the same health rights as national citizens. Many other European states, migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, have not had access to the same kinds of health rates in ways that have affected the ability of those states to sort of deal with the pandemic and have made the inequalities, as it were, even more starkly visible. So I do think that the ways in which particular states have handled the challenges of the pandemics will have implications on how politics in those states develops in the kind of post-pandemic, or rather not really quite post-pandemic, but declining pandemic conditions. And that'll be fascinating to see what the relationship between the governance of a public health during COVID and the sort of politics emerging from that will be.
Yes, thank you for that. And Arlene, from your perspective, we've seen a variety of responses from Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and Cuba. Your reflections on this broader relationship between democracy and the pandemic.
Sadly, I don't know that there's many success stories in the region that we can point to, because essentially what the pandemic has put into painful relief is profound types of inequality in Latin America, the crisis of democracy and of state institutions, and deficiencies in particular in public health and other public services. Perhaps one might point to Uruguay, which we always point to as, a hopeful case. I'm also hopeful in the case of Chile. Just remind our listeners that also following widespread social protests in Chile, a new constitutional assembly has been put together, which is quite representative of different sectors of society and provides a source of hope going forward as to what democracy in that country, understood in a much more robust sense, might look like. So I guess in that sense, I think we might be hopeful, given that the pandemic has put, in our faces, literally, inequalities within and between countries. I guess I would also share David's, source of hope that there's some degree of reckoning on the part of both political and social actors in terms of what needs to be done to address these issues, which, are only compounded by the pandemic. But I think also beyond inequality, the pandemic, at least to me, has also led to questions in relation to democracy in terms of who is the human in human rights? What are human rights? How broadly or how limited we should consider them in attending to the needs of different populations, in particular vulnerable and marginal ones. And so I guess I have a mixture of pessimism and hope in terms of how we go forward with this. But I do think that without a hard and long reflection on the limitations of liberal ideas of democracy, human rights, and whatnot, my sources of hope would tend to be reduced.
I like this idea of putting the human back in human rights, but also this idea of reflection. The pandemic has put a mirror up to democracy in very profound ways. And all of the things that have been highlighted by that sharp look at ourselves, and I include myself in that group of democracies because I do live in the UK and have grown up in the United States. It's a turning point. It's a real time for lessons learned and a reckoning, as you say. So it just says really for me now to thank both you, David Owen and Arlene Tickner, for sharing incredibly deep insights about not only cases around the world, but that larger conceptual discussion that's required now on how do we move forward, the fate of democracy, the future of democracy and human rights in the face of these exogenous and external threats such as the pandemic. So for now, can I just say on behalf of the Rights Track, thank you very much for your time with us today.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. This is the last episode of Series 6, but we'll be back in the autumn of 2021 with Series 7, when we'll be discussing human rights in a digital world. So stay subscribed for more sound evidence on human rights with The Rights Track.